One of the biggest storylines from this past offseason was the Titans trading A.J. Brown to the Eagles. In exchange for Brown, the Eagles sent over the 18th overall pick, and Tennessee used that to draft Treylon Burks out of Arkansas. Almost immediately after this trade completed, the Eagles extended Brown with a huge 4-year deal worth up to $100 million and $57 million guaranteed. Suffice to say, this trade has already been paying huge dividends for the Eagles offense. Brown is currently in 6th place in receiving yards, and he also has 6 touchdowns too. While I was going through the Eagles film over the past couple of weeks, what really stood out to me was Brown's development since he came out of college. Based on this, I believe A.J. Brown is a top 7 receiver. I also think we should consider him in the top 5 as well. In this video, I wanted to look at his development and see why he's so effective in the Eagles offense. Before we begin, if you can do me a huge favor and like and subscribe to my channel, I would greatly appreciate it. So anyways, I wanted to start this breakdown by talking about Brown back while he was in college at Ole Miss. The number one thing that scouts pointed out about Brown was that since he primarily lined up in the slot, he didn't have a lot of experience dealing with press coverage even at the college level. On top of this, they said he struggled to separate against elite cornerbacks in college due to issues with dealing with top-tier speed. What's interesting is that so far in his career with the Titans and now the Eagles, this can't be farther from the truth. This is actually a huge part of his role with the Eagles. Brown lines up as an outside receiver on 70% of his snaps, while only lining up in the slot on just 30% of the time. Looking at his film, Brown is one of those rare receivers who can do both of these roles extremely well. I do think that in the Eagles scheme, however, he's a better fit for the outside role as opposed to the inside. I think instead of him working to find space against zone coverage, Brown is much better taking on cornerbacks one-on-one. His footwork and his hand-fighting skills are the main reasons for this. This is a big reason why Brown exploded against the Pittsburgh Steelers back in Week 8. The Steelers played a ton of single high man coverage, and since Brown ran a bunch of fades and comebacks, he became the primary read for Jalen Hurts. Now, while I was going through his film, the first thing I noticed about the Eagles scheme overall was the high quantity of play action and run pass options. These two concepts form the foundation of the Eagles playbook. During these snaps, or even in their standard shotgun drop back passing play calls, A.J. Brown tended to run a relatively basic route tree. I saw a lot of slants, I saw quick hitches, I saw him running those fades and comebacks like we talked about before, and I also saw some quick seams or dig routes where he would work to find space underneath the safeties. What's interesting about the Eagles offense is that Jalen Hurts doesn't really throw the ball deep very often. If you look at quarterbacks that have more than 100 passing attempts, Jalen Hurts ranks in the bottom 3 in dropback percentage, where his throw traveled 20 yards or more down the field. What I found impressive is that these throws were all usually pretty good. Hurts is actually a really good down the field passer, and he's been that way all season long. On his attempts, Hurts has the 4th highest completion percentage of 48%, he's completed 4 touchdowns and 0 picks, his yards per attempt ranks 3rd overall at 18.5, and his NFL passer rating on throws 20 yards or more is 133 when the average is just 70. From my vantage point, I think Hurts is just relatively conservative with the football. He doesn't take the deep shot unless he thinks he has a good opportunity. Now, before I mentioned that the Steelers played a ton of single high man coverage against the Eagles. Against this defense, A.J. Brown became the default weapon because he was a great matchup for Hurts on the outside. Multiple throws down the field went his direction. What Brown brings to the field is that quick footwork at the top of his stems and the hand-fighting skills I mentioned before. Brown is excellent at creating in this offense on his own. This is why Hurts trusted him on those deep throws and why the Steelers game was Brown's 2nd highest targets on the year. Let's take a quick look at one of my favorite plays from this game. This happened at the end of the first quarter. It was a 2nd and 10. The Steelers have one safety deep and are playing cover one man. This means the single high safety is responsible for the deep middle portion of the field, while the cornerbacks across the field are defending their opposing players man to man. Meanwhile, the Eagles are in shotgun. They have a twin stacks look on the left, while A.J. Brown lines up on the backside of the play. A common route for a backside receiver in this type of formation, lining up between the numbers and the sideline, is a fade or comeback. That's what Brown is running here. Brown is facing Ahkello Witherspoon after the snap. As the pair ran down the field, Witherspoon is actually in a good position where he starts to extend his right arm in an attempt to bump Brown off his route. What I want you to watch is how Brown responds to this punch. His downward strike to clean his frame is what allows him to turn on the spot to get free. He swiped down, dropped his hips to turn quickly in minimal steps, and then he drove back towards the pass, cleanly bringing it for the grab. Brown gained 9 yards on this play. Now, this play obviously wasn't one of Brown's biggest during this one, but the hand swipe is something that I saw over and over again. Brown's accuracy in using this move is something that I really liked. The other thing that I really liked is Brown's footwork at the top of his stems. Before we look at that in detail, this video is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. They let you draft your fantasy team in minutes, and you can use that team to cash in your knowledge. They also have pick'ems where you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night. You pick between 2 and 5 players, and these entries make boring games so much more fun. Now, as a bonus to anybody that signs up using my promo code GOLD, I'll give you my fantasy cheat sheet so you can see my rankings and who I'm targeting on a week-by-week basis. For example, I entered this afternoon-only contest back in week 6, and I made $16 off this draft. It would have been so much more if MVS created any sort of fantasy points against the Bills. While that was frustrating to say the least, I drafted another team in week 7 using my rankings, and I made $10 off this entry in their beginner double up. Go ahead, sign up using my promo code GOLD, and along with my fantasy cheat sheets, Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100 in bonus cash when you make a deposit of $10 or more. Deposit $100 and get $100 free. Now back to the breakdown, I showed you that last play against man coverage, and that's really where AJ Brown excels. He's a monster at beating defenders one-on-one. Brown does a great job of not giving away his attention on the route until he's already cutting. With Brown, he'll start his stem at 80% speed, and then when he hits the top of his route, he'll accelerate while using a stutter jab step before breaking on the play. It's extremely difficult to guard against, especially from an off-man position. For example, Brown beat Derek Stingley Jr. a few times using this footwork even when he was in target against the Texans. The other thing that I really like about Brown is how quickly he'll snap his head back to the quarterback looking for the ball. He makes himself very available to his quarterback. He always seems ready to make a play the instant it goes his direction. Now, seeing this consistently in his tape was really interesting because historically Brown has a huge problem with drops. Even dating back to his time in college at Ole Miss, drops have been a huge issue his entire career. With the Eagles so far, Brown has actually improved at this trait so far this season. When the average receiver drops 5.7% of their targets, Brown is only slightly worse than the average at 6.5%. While this sounds bad, last year with the Titans, Brown dropped 12% of his targets. He was bottom 10 in the NFL that season, whereas this year he's roughly average. Now, speaking of advanced stats, one of my favorite metrics for wide receivers is yards per route run. This stat does a great job showing wide receiver efficiency, and it also shows the ability of a receiver to create on the opportunities that they're given. So far during the 2022 season, the average wide receiver is creating 1.5 yards per route run. The best in the NFL are roughly double this metric. If you look at receivers with more than 50 routes, Brown is currently ranked 4th overall in this stat. I also mentioned earlier how good Brown is against man coverage. This shows up in this metric too. According to Pro Football Focus, Brown is 3rd overall in yards per route run against man coverage. Now, while his production against man coverage is amazing, against zone coverage, this is a different story. Brown is ranked 56 out of 110 receivers with more than 50 routes in the season. This isn't bad by any means, but it's certainly nowhere near his ability against man coverage. Outside of yards per route run, the other advanced stat that I like comes from ESPN and their use of next-gen stats. They score wide receivers in 3 respective areas. First, you have open score, which is a receiver's ability to get open compared to a receiver's expected separation on the same route against the same coverage. Next is catch score, which is how likely a receiver will catch a pass based on the probability of them making that catch down the field. And finally, you have yak score, which is their ability to create after the catch as compared to what the average receiver is expected to create in the same situation. In these metrics, AJ Brown is number 1 overall. He's top 3 in open score, he's above average in his catch score, and he's top 5 in yak. I mentioned this before, but his catching ability has always been his Achilles heel, and straight up, it just seems like a lack of concentration on any given play. From watching him, I feel like he tries too hard to make that play in the first place, and he does that before the ball arrives. This is why he drops it. While I know this sounds negative, Brown's ability to get open and his ability to create yak in the first place is truly outstanding. He's elite in those areas. If Brown stays at roughly average in catch score, I'm completely okay with this trade-off given how great Brown is in these other areas. Now, I mentioned that Brown was roughly average in yards per route run against zone coverage. As I went through his film, I think a lot of this does have to do with scheme and the routes that he ran. A large percent of the time, Brown was that outside role where he wasn't always involved in the main portion of the concept. Fades and posts, for example, are often clear out routes against zone coverage schemes. The Eagles, on the other hand, they really like using Devontae Smith as that zone beating option. While Devontae Smith is ranked 52nd against man coverage, he actually ranks in the top 15 against zone. This is where Smith really shines, and it shows all throughout his film. For example, on this 3-level flood concept against the Cardinals, AJ Brown is the backside receiver and will only get targeted as the 4th read on the play. Meanwhile, Smith is running the deep curl where the inside receiver runs deep to clear out room from by the numbers. This entire play design against a single high zone coverage team is meant for Smith to get the ball. AJ Brown will only be targeted as a method of last resort. Now, going back to Brown, there are very few weaknesses to his game. I think the number one thing is the drop issue that we've already talked about. The other thing is that on occasion, Brown will take too many steps to the top of his breaks, especially when he's fully trying to flip his hips. I think he's gotten better at this over time, but I did notice this on occasion. While this may be the case, how he stems his routes and his footwork at the top is what really helps him create separation. This plus those hand fighting skills we talked about earlier, and it's easy to see why Brown has been super effective in the Eagles offense. Well, that's all I have for you. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to support the channel directly, feel free to follow into my Patreon account below. Also, you can find me on Twitter at Samuel R. Gold.